The final act of Bumpy Johnson's life did not begin with sirens, headlines, or a dramatic collapse. It began with quiet. The kind of quiet that only appears when a powerful man realizes the world around him is changing faster than his body can keep up. Harlem still moved on its familiar rhythm, but under that rhythm, pressure had been building for years. By the time Bumpy entered his last days, the threat was no longer a single rival or a single case file. The threat was time itself, and time never negotiated. In those final days, Bumpy Johnson carried two realities at once. In public, he was still a name that meant restraint, discipline, and consequence. People spoke it carefully, even if they pretended not to. In private, he was an aging man feeling the limits of strength that once felt endless. His health was not a rumor anymore. It was a factor. And when health becomes a factor, everyone around a powerful figure begins calculating what happens after the figure is gone. This is where the unseen story starts. The most dangerous period in any empire is the moment people smell transition. Harlem did not need a formal announcement to sense it. Small shifts appeared first. Younger operators pushed boundaries more often. Outsiders tested limits with less hesitation. Law enforcement pressure intensified in ways that felt coordinated rather than random. The neighborhood still looked stable, but stability at that level always came at a cost, and Bumpy had been paying that cost personally for years. Bumpy's daily routine narrowed, not because he surrendered, but because he adapted. He moved less, watched more, spoke less, and chose his appearances carefully. That restraint had always been part of his strength, but now it served a different purpose. It was not just strategy, it was preservation. He understood that visibility attracted attention, and attention invited intervention. In his last days, he did not need more eyes on him. He needed less. Yet paradoxically, the quieter he became, the louder his shadow grew. When powerful men withdraw, people assume plotting. They assume fear. They assume something is coming. And when assumptions begin replacing facts, panic follows. Harlem entered a phase where rumors became more influential than reality. Some whispered that Bumpy was preparing to vanish. Others claimed he was setting traps for enemies. Others insisted he was already finished, and the city simply had not admitted it yet. Bumpy understood the danger of rumor better than anyone. Rumor could start wars faster than bullets. The final act of his life was not fought with violence as the main tool. It was fought through control of perception. He needed Harlem to believe in continuity, even as his own body moved toward collapse. This period revealed the most complicated part of his legacy. Bumpy Johnson had always been portrayed as a man who held Harlem together through fear, but fear cannot sustain a community for decades. What sustained Harlem was predictability. It was the belief that the neighborhood had rules that mattered. That discipline created breathing room for ordinary people to live. Bumpy's true power had always been in what did not happen. The wars that never started. The chaos that never spread. The outsiders who never fully took over. As his final days approached, Bumpy became obsessed with one question. Would that stability survive him? This question haunted every step. Harlem had enemies that did not fear him the way individuals once did. Institutions were patient. Markets were ruthless. Younger men were impatient. The world was shifting from street power to system power, from reputation to paperwork, from neighborhood control to citywide leverage. Bumpy could feel that shift even if Harlem could not fully articulate it. It made his final days feel heavier than any previous threat. He began preparing for absence, not through dramatic orders, but through quiet reinforcement of boundaries. He encouraged discipline where he could. He discouraged reckless ambition. He pushed stability into routines that could outlast him. This was not charity. It was survival planning for an entire neighborhood. The emotional weight of this phase was brutal because it forced Bumpy to confront what he had always avoided: vulnerability. Aging makes every man vulnerable, but it makes powerful men dangerous because their vulnerability invites others to move. Those final days were a tightening circle of pressure. Friends looked at him with worry. Rivals looked at him with opportunity. Institutions looked at him with calculation. And through all of it, Harlem kept moving, unaware that its most carefully maintained balance was approaching the point where it would have to survive without its most visible stabilizer. The final act of Bumpy Johnson was not about one last triumph. It was about one last test, a test of whether influence could become legacy, and whether Harlem's heartbeat could continue once the man who protected its rhythm was gone. If Harlem believed Bumpy Johnson's final days were quiet, it was only because the most dangerous move of his life was unfolding invisibly, and the next morning would reveal a shift that could never be reversed. Before the final chapter officially closed, Harlem began to feel something it had not felt in decades. Uncertainty without a clear source. Nothing dramatic announced this change. There were no explosions, no public betrayals, no sudden collapse of order. Instead, the neighborhood experienced a slow, emotional drift, as if its internal compass had begun to spin without settling on a fixed direction. This was the true beginning of the end, and most people did not realize they were living inside it. For years, Harlem had functioned on an unspoken understanding that balance existed because someone was watching. That understanding did not require daily reminders. It lived in habit, in caution, in restraint. As Bumpy Johnson's presence grew quieter, that invisible assurance weakened. People still followed the rules, but they began checking over their shoulders more often. Discipline remained, but confidence thinned. This was not fear in the traditional sense. It was anticipation. Anticipation is more dangerous than fear because it invites imagination to fill gaps. Harlem's imagination began working overtime. Shop owners noticed unfamiliar faces lingering longer than usual. Longtime residents sensed shifts in tone during casual conversations. Younger figures tested limits just enough to see whether resistance would come. When it did not arrive immediately, assumptions followed. Bumpy Johnson was still alive, still respected, still feared in some circles. But power does not disappear all at once. It erodes at the edges. Harlem felt that erosion first in subtle ways. Disputes took longer to resolve. Negotiations that once ended quietly required repeated discussion. Outsiders pushed boundaries with calculated patience rather than reckless force. The neighborhood was being measured. This phase revealed how deeply Bumpy's influence had been woven into everyday life. His absence was not physical. It was psychological. People realized that much of their restraint came from belief rather than enforcement. Once belief began to waver, even slightly, behavior adjusted accordingly. Harlem was not collapsing. It was recalibrating. Bumpy understood this better than anyone. From his perspective, the danger was not rebellion, but fragmentation. A single figure can absorb pressure. A fractured system cannot. His final efforts were not about asserting dominance, but about reinforcing cohesion. He encouraged continuity through routines, relationships, and expectations. He wanted Harlem to rely on itself, not on his shadow. The emotional toll of this transition was heavy. Longtime associates felt the strain of responsibility increasing without clear authority. Community figures stepped forward cautiously, unsure how far their influence extended. Harlem had survived external pressure before, but internal uncertainty was a different kind of threat. It weakened decision-making and invited mistakes. Law enforcement attention intensified during this period, sensing vulnerability without fully understanding it. Patrols increased, surveillance lingered longer. The assumption was simple: when power shifts, opportunity follows. What authorities did not see was how carefully Harlem was trying to avoid confirming that assumption. Overreaction would have justified intervention. Calm was resistance. Bumpy Johnson's legacy at this moment was being tested in real time. Had he built something that could endure without him, or had Harlem become dependent on his presence? This question hovered over every interaction. It shaped choices quietly, without debate or declaration. The neighborhood's true heartbeat revealed itself through restraint. Despite pressure, widespread violence did not erupt. Despite rumors, chaos did not take hold. Harlem held itself together through memory and habit. That alone was evidence of something deeper than fear-based control. It suggested a community that had learned discipline through experience, not intimidation. Yet the strain was undeniable. Holding balance without a central stabilizer required effort. Effort fatigues. Fatigue leads to error. Bumpy could sense this coming. His final days were marked by urgency masked as calm. He knew that whatever happened next would define how history remembered not just him, but Harlem itself. This period was the quietest and most dangerous phase of all. Nothing appeared wrong on the surface. Beneath it, however, forces were aligning that would soon force resolution. Harlem was approaching a moment where uncertainty would demand an answer, and that answer would arrive sooner than anyone expected. As Harlem struggled to maintain balance through belief alone, a sudden turn of events would transform uncertainty into finality, forcing the neighborhood to confront what happens when a living legend becomes a memory overnight. The night Bumpy Johnson's heart finally gave out did not arrive with drama. It arrived with stillness. Harlem went to sleep, believing tomorrow would look like yesterday, unaware that the stabilizing force it had leaned on for decades was about to vanish without warning. There was no public farewell, no final directive, no carefully orchestrated exit. When Bumpy Johnson died, the balance he had spent a lifetime maintaining was left suspended in midair. What made this moment so destabilizing was not just death, but timing. Bumpy did not fall during a war or a public confrontation. He died quietly, away from the street, without giving Harlem time to prepare psychologically. The neighborhood did not experience shock immediately. It experienced confusion. Confusion is far more dangerous than panic because it delays response. Word traveled unevenly. Some heard early, others dismissed it as rumor. Harlem had learned not to believe everything it heard, especially about powerful men. For years, stories of Bumpy's downfall had circulated prematurely. This time was different, but difference takes time to register. That delay created a vacuum where assumptions multiplied faster than fact. By morning, the truth could no longer be denied. The man who had embodied restraint, consequence, and continuity was gone. Harlem did not erupt. It paused. That pause was the sound of recalculation. Every individual, every group, every outside force began asking the same unspoken question: what happens now? The immediate aftermath revealed how much order had depended on expectation rather than enforcement. No one issued commands to riot or retaliate. No one declared open season. Instead, Harlem held its breath. People waited to see who would move first. In moments like this, the first move often determines the future. Bumpy Johnson's death exposed the difference between power and infrastructure. Power can disappear overnight. Infrastructure lingers, but only if it has been internalized. Harlem's routines continued out of habit, not certainty. Businesses opened cautiously. Meetings were postponed. Decisions were delayed. This hesitation was not weakness. It was survival instinct. Outsiders sensed opportunity almost immediately. Institutions moved slowly, but rivals did not. Smaller operators tested boundaries with subtle moves, not open challenges but quiet probes. A late payment, an unauthorized presence, a minor rule bent deliberately. These were not acts of aggression. They were questions. Harlem's response to those questions would shape its future. The most dangerous aspect of this night was its invisibility. There was no single event to react to, no clear enemy, no obvious threat. Everything happened beneath the surface. Harlem's strength had always been its ability to manage unseen pressures. Now those pressures multiplied without a central figure absorbing them. Emotionally, the loss cut deeper than many expected. Even those who had disagreed with Bumpy or resented his authority felt unmoored. Stability, once gone, reveals its value too late. Harlem realized that much of its peace had been borrowed from a man whose presence had discouraged chaos simply by existing. This realization forced a reckoning. Was Harlem prepared to carry that responsibility collectively, or would it fracture under competing visions of control? Bumpy had never positioned himself as a replacement for community discipline. He had reinforced it, but reinforcement fades when the reinforcing force disappears. Funeral preparations intensified this tension. Public mourning risked attracting attention. Private mourning risked appearing weak. Harlem navigated this dilemma carefully. Respect was shown without spectacle. The neighborhood understood that grief itself could become a trigger if misinterpreted. Law enforcement observed closely. They expected reaction. They anticipated escalation. What they saw instead was restraint bordering on defiance. Harlem refused to become the chaos others anticipated. That refusal was the final proof of Bumpy Johnson's most misunderstood legacy. He had taught the neighborhood how not to fall apart. Yet restraint alone could not answer the question of leadership. Absence demands replacement. Replacement invites conflict. The days following his death were filled with silent calculations. Who could command respect without provoking war? Who could maintain discipline without becoming a target? Harlem faced a decision it had postponed for decades. Bumpy Johnson's final act was not something he did in death. It was something he left behind in life. A community capable of hesitation, capable of restraint, capable of understanding that survival sometimes requires waiting rather than acting. But waiting has limits. As the night that took Bumpy Johnson turned into a morning without him, Harlem stood on the edge of transformation. The anchor was gone. The waters were moving, and the next phase would reveal whether his legacy was strong enough to hold without the man who built it. With the stabilizing force gone, and every eye watching for the first crack, Harlem's next decision would determine whether Bumpy Johnson's legacy became a foundation or a fault line. Asterisk. After the burial, the real struggle began, not in public view, not with gunfire or declarations, but in the quiet, grinding tension of a community deciding who it wanted to be without its most powerful protector. Harlem had buried Bumpy Johnson, but it had not buried the question he left behind. The days following his death were the most dangerous Harlem had faced in decades, precisely because nothing happened quickly. Power vacuums do not explode immediately. They inhale first. Every corner of Harlem felt heavier. Meetings multiplied behind closed doors. Longtime figures reappeared cautiously. Younger operators mistook silence for weakness and patience for permission. Everyone understood the stakes. If Harlem fractured now, outsiders would not hesitate to step in and claim what remained. This was the moment Bumpy Johnson had spent his final years quietly preparing for, even if few recognized it at the time. The most critical test was restraint. Violence would have been easy. Emotional reactions would have been justified. But Harlem remembered something deeper than anger. It remembered consequence. Years of stability had trained the neighborhood to think beyond impulse. That training now became the deciding factor between survival and collapse. Community leaders emerged not as replacements for Bumpy, but as custodians of continuity. They did not claim dominance. They reinforced routines. Businesses were encouraged to operate normally. Disputes were handled through mediation rather than escalation. The goal was simple, but difficult. Prevent the first major mistake. Harlem knew that once blood was spilled publicly, control would be lost permanently. Law enforcement pressure increased sharply during this period. Authorities expected disorder and prepared accordingly. Patrols intensified, surveillance widened. Harlem responded with discipline. The absence of chaos became a form of resistance. It denied outsiders the justification they sought. This phase revealed the true depth of Bumpy Johnson's influence. He had not ruled through constant intervention. He had trained the environment itself. Harlem's response to loss was not emotional paralysis, but collective calculation. People asked not what they wanted, but what the neighborhood needed. There were challenges. Rival factions tested limits discreetly. Minor violations occurred. Boundaries were pushed quietly. Each incident was addressed quickly and locally, without spectacle. Harlem refused to allow any single provocation to define the moment. This refusal was deliberate. It preserved leverage. What made this period especially cinematic was its stillness. Every decision carried weight. Every non-decision carried risk. Harlem moved like a chessboard where no one wanted to make the first move, fully aware that the first move often loses. Bumpy Johnson's legacy shifted in perception during these days. He was no longer seen merely as a man who held power. He was recognized as someone who had delayed chaos long enough for the community to learn how to resist it without him. That realization changed how people spoke about him, even in private. The most remarkable outcome of this phase was continuity. Harlem did not fall into immediate violence. It did not surrender control to outsiders. It did not fracture into open conflict. That continuity did not mean safety was guaranteed. It meant time was bought. And time is the most valuable resource during transition. As weeks passed, it became clear that Harlem had chosen discipline over dominance. This choice did not eliminate danger. It redefined it. Power would no longer concentrate in one figure. It would disperse, unevenly and imperfectly, across relationships, memory, and mutual interest. But dispersion carries its own risks. Without a single anchor, accountability becomes harder to enforce. Harlem understood this tension. The battle after the burial was not won outright. It was managed, day by day, through vigilance and restraint. The question now was whether this fragile equilibrium could survive long-term pressures, whether the lessons learned under Bumpy Johnson could endure once the immediacy of loss faded and ambition returned. Because history does not test communities once. It tests them repeatedly. As Harlem stabilized, without a single ruler for the first time in a generation, a new challenge emerged, one that threatened not through violence, but through forgetting what Bumpy Johnson had quietly taught them about survival. When the noise finally settled and the city moved on, Harlem was left with something far more complex than a memory. It was left with a legacy that could not be buried, arrested, or rewritten by outsiders. Bumpy Johnson's final act was not his death, but what survived him. And what survived was not fear, violence, or control. It was a way of living under pressure without surrendering identity. This is the part of the story most people never consider. Legacies are usually measured in territory, money, or notoriety. But Harlem measured Bumpy Johnson's legacy in continuity. The neighborhood did not collapse. It did not immediately fall into open warfare. It did not become the free-for-all that many had predicted. Instead, it continued, uneasily, imperfectly, but deliberately. That continuation was not accidental. It was learned behavior. Bumpy Johnson had spent decades teaching Harlem a quiet lesson. Power is temporary, but discipline can be inherited. He understood that no single man could rule forever, but a community could be trained to survive without one. His final years were not about expansion or dominance. They were about preparing the neighborhood to exist without his shadow while still respecting the boundaries his presence had enforced. After his death, Harlem faced pressures that had been held back for years. Federal scrutiny intensified. Economic forces shifted. New generations emerged with less patience for old rules, yet the core of the neighborhood resisted erasure. It adapted rather than exploded. That adaptability was Bumpy's true imprint. The most telling sign of his legacy was restraint. People remembered what chaos cost. They remembered how quickly outside forces exploited disorder. They remembered that stability, even when uncomfortable, protected more lives than reckless ambition ever could. These memories guided behavior long after Bumpy Johnson was gone. Over time, his name changed meaning. It stopped being a warning and became a reference point. Not for fear, but for understanding how Harlem once protected itself when no one else would. He became a symbol of self-determination in an era when options were limited and survival demanded compromise. This does not sanitize his life. Bumpy Johnson was not a hero in the traditional sense. He operated in a world shaped by crime, inequality, and violence. But legacies are rarely clean. They are shaped by circumstance as much as choice. Harlem did not remember him because he was perfect. It remembered him because he was effective in protecting space for everyday life to exist. The streets he once walked continued to change. Gentrification arrived. New faces replaced old ones. Businesses turned over. Yet, even as Harlem transformed physically, the memory of how it once held itself together endured. Stories were passed down. Lessons survived in tone, caution, and pride. The heartbeat adjusted, but it did not stop. What makes this legacy powerful is its invisibility. There is no monument that captures it fully. No plaque explains how order once functioned without formal authority. No archive records the moments that never happened because restraint prevailed. But those absences tell the story better than any headline ever could. Bumpy Johnson's final act was not domination. It was preparation. He left Harlem with a framework for survival that did not rely on him being alive. That is the rarest form of power, to make oneself unnecessary. This is why his story continues to matter. Not because of what he took, but because of what he preserved. Not because of the fear he inspired, but because of the discipline he normalized. Harlem's ability to endure transition without immediate collapse was the proof of his unseen work. And yet, legacies are fragile. They survive only as long as they are remembered and respected. Forgetting invites repetition of mistakes. The greatest danger to Harlem was never losing Bumpy Johnson. It was forgetting what his era revealed about survival under pressure. The final truth is this: Bumpy Johnson did not define Harlem. Harlem defined what kind of man he became. And when he was gone, the neighborhood carried forward the parts of him that mattered most, not the violence, not the legend, but the understanding that stability is an act of resistance. If one man's quiet discipline could shape a community's survival for generations, what other untold legacies are hiding beneath the stories we think we already know, and which truths will disappear forever if no one dares to look deeper?